Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear friends. I am Ehsan, YouTube lecturer on genetics, and this channel is all about genetics. So today we will discuss about history of classical genetics in detail. First of all, we want to introduce classical genetics. That what is classical genetics? Classical genetics refers to the study of the laws of hereditary transmission in living organisms. It is distinguished from molecular genetics, both temporary. It is simply the study of laws of hereditary transmission in living organisms. Simply, classical genetics. And we start the history of classical genetics from the beginner, from medical man, early breeders, hybridist, and hereditarian, that in the 18th century investigators were busy trying to settle one of the outstanding questions relating to life, that how from the union of male and female sperm does an organism develop. Does the male sperm somehow provide form to the formless matter of the female egg? Initiating a progressive transformation, as Aristotle had argued, the epigenetics theory. Now, so it is all the thoughts and all the knowledge about the heredity, that what factors bring that offspring is similar to parent, and several disease is carrying on, running on in the families. That what the reason behind this, but these experimental plant hybridizer and animal breeder set out to test this revolutionary possibility, the idea that there is a single general expression for the similarity between parents and offspring, that what we would now call heredity. First, we doesn't call that heredity, developed in the late 18th century through the work of French physician. And the next slide is about the first person, and the first process is that a leading early figure in this investigation was the German naturalist J.G. Carl Luther in 1733 and 1806, one of the first to carry out experiment in hybridization. So that, and the next, the Englishman Thomas Andrew Knight 1759 to 1838 is also of particular importance for the history of classical genetics. Knight first identified the common golden fee as ideal for crossing experiment, having grasped that its breeding can be tightly controlled as the structure of its flower prevent pollination from outsider. And later in 1824, two of Knight's compatriots, J. Gauss and S. Sutton, described the phenomena of dominance once again in fee. And next, when the German Wagner 1805 and 1864 began to argue at mid-century that analyze amounts of data of hybridization experiment could be helpful, the stage was set for someone to come along and put the piece together, and that person was Mendel. In 1830, the term heredity was widespread. The English term was first used in plant in 1863. That this notation means that word heredity united various aspects that were previously considered destiny. Mean that heredity word, when the heredity word comes forward, all the knowledge of genetics comes to one stage. An inheritance of normal pathological similarities, species typical and individual similarity, and maternal and potential influence first develops for understanding of human heredity. The notation of heredity spread to theoretical and practical work on plant and animals, and from these, the notation of from these were heredity and the knowledge of heredity and the knowledge of genetics, spread to theoretical and practical work on plants and animals. Historically, classical genetics had its origin in Gregor Mendel's paper on inheritance in bees, published in 1866. That was originally origin of classical genetics. By the time the result and conclusion of Mendel Garden P experiment were rediscovered in 1900, mean in 1900, his work is rediscovered. Classical genetics has its origin in the 1850s and 1960, mean that classical genetic origin is between 1850 and 1860. Who was that man when the Marvin Mount Gregor Mendel attempt to formalize the rules of inheritance governing plant hybridization? Mean when Mendel present some rules of genetics for, yeah, some rule of heredity for uh, genetics present, and and in 1909, the Danish biologist William Johnson proposed that there are two sources of variation, one arising from the action of the environment and the other due to arising from the action of and the other due to variation in Mendel's hereditary vector. And he called these entities gene. Mean that from Johnson proposed that there are two sources. One is phenotypical and one is genotypic. One is from environment and one is from Mendelian experiment gene. When Mendel's laws were rediscovered in 1900, breeding experiments were leading to cytological observation of chromosomes in the nucleus of organisms, mostly notable in fruit fly, and classical genetics was born. And that was when Mendel's work and experiment were rediscovered. And the chromosome theory of inheritance that was formulated as a result of this work stated that genes are located linearly on chromosomes. And later on, from this work, some model were presented that what gene do and what they are made of, what gene do and what they are made of. This well approach involving breeding and microscopy was famously championed by Thomas Hunt Morgan and a student in the 1910 and what became known as the Playroom Laboratory at Columbia University. Morgan and his student focused on transmission, opposed to development and evolution, and show that hereditary trait expressed in the phenotype of fruit fly could be correlated to physical gene land upon on the chromosome in the fly nucleus. Simply stated, implying that gene embedded in the hereditary vector imply that gene embedded in the hereditary vector transmitted from generation to generation, and that vector and trait were not the same entity, mean that a chance mutations occur. Danish biologist William Johnson distinguished theoretically between genotype and phenotype in the 1909. The English Mendelian William Bateson had coined the term for a new science in 1905. Morgan and his crew were depicting the birth of modern genetics. At the end uh, of 20th century, these two type of question arose: what do genes actually do and what are genes actually made of? The first of these questions originated in biochemical investigation of inborn error of metabolism in human initiated by the English physician H. George in the first decade of 20th century and ultimately lead to the notation that one gene create one enzyme or one protein. That one gene create one enzyme or one protein. So it is all about history of classical genetic. At the end, for you, we presents a summary history of classical genetics from 1733 to 1910. J. G. Colruyter in 1733-1806 experimentally experiments on hybridization. Thomas Andrew Knight 1759 to 1839. Importance for the history of classical genetics on pea plant. J. Goss and S. Sutton in 1824 described the phenomena of dominance once again in pea. German R. Wigner 1805-1864 began to argue at mid-century to analyze the most of idea of hybridization experiment. And After that, Mendel published paper in 1866 and about inheritance. And after that, in 1900, its work is rediscovered, and the English Mendelian, the English Mendelian The English Mendelian William Bertson coined the term from the New Scene in 1905 and kept the base of modern genetics. Modern genetics. It is all about classical genetics. It is all about classical. And at the end, Danish biologist William Johnson distinguished theoretically between genotype and phenotype in 1909. In 1909, the Danish biologist William Johnson proposed that there are two sources of variation, one arising from the action of the environment that we call phenotype, and the second or the other due to a variation in mental hereditary factor which we call genotype, and which come from entity Johnson called gene, which come from genes, mean that Mendel described the about the genes. Thomas Hearn Morgan and a student in the 1910. Morgan and a student focus on transmission opposed to development and evolution, and this is all about classical genetics, history of classical genetics. And so thanks for watching us, and subscribe our YouTube channel for next related genetics videos, and like our videos please. Ehsan Genetics YouTube lecture.